The origins of the wall. When you close your eyes and imagine a medieval city, perhaps the first image that rises is not the cathedral or the market square, but the long, silent line of the walls that surround it. Walls are what mark the boundary between inside and outside, between community and wilderness, between order and chaos. To live within the walls was to belong, and to find oneself outside them was to be exposed. Yet, though we often picture them in moments of siege or in the glow of romantic ruins, the true story of medieval walls is far quieter and perhaps more fascinating for its silence. The origins of these walls stretch far back, long before the medieval age itself. In the Roman world, fortified towns were common. Roman engineers, with their disciplined geometry, laid out camps and cities with straight streets, square walls, and watchtowers at regular intervals. When the empire declined, many of these walls remained, sometimes intact, sometimes broken into fragments. In Britain, you might have seen Saxon villages huddling within old Roman fortresses. In France, Merovingian kings held courts inside Gallo-Roman walls. These Roman relics offered a starting point for the medieval imagination, proof that stone could divide, protect, and define. But the medieval world did not inherit a stable empire. Instead, it faced migrations, invasions, and uncertainties. The collapse of central authority left towns vulnerable. Viking raiders swept inland by river. Magyar horsemen galloped across plains. Saracen fleets harassed southern coasts. Communities, frightened and fragile, learned again the value of stone and timber. If Rome had offered grand, enduring fortifications, the early Middle Ages often relied on simpler means: wooden palisades on earthen mounds, ditches filled with water, and hastily repaired fragments of ancient walls. The technology was humble, but the purpose was the same: to draw a line around what mattered most. Picture an early medieval settlement at twilight. The houses are timber, the roofs thatched. Chickens scratch in muddy lanes. Beyond the last row of dwellings rises a palisade, sharpened logs set upright, bound together with crossbeams, reinforced with soil at the base. It is not beautiful, nor is it permanent, but to those within, it is a comfort. A guard with a spear leans against the gatepost, yawning as the last villagers return from the fields. Behind him, smoke curls from cooking fires. The wall, rough and creaking in the wind, is a threshold between danger and familiarity. Over time, prosperity allowed some of these wooden defenses to be replaced with stone. Quarries supplied limestone or sandstone. Masons cut blocks. Oxen dragged carts. Slowly, ditches deepened, ramparts rose, and crude palisades gave way to curtain walls. Long stretches of stone connecting towers and gates. These early walls were often uneven, built in stages as funds allowed. One part of the town might have a sturdy stone barrier, while another still relied on earthworks. Yet even a patchwork defense mattered. It signaled intention. This community meant to endure, to root itself, to stand apart from the open wilderness. The symbolism of walls was as important as their function. To enclose a town was not simply to guard against attack, but to declare its identity. Inside the walls, markets operated under civic laws, guilds organized trades, churches held authority over souls. Outside, beyond the gates, fields and forests stretched, less regulated, more dangerous. To pass through a gate was to cross from one world into another. A merchant entering might pause beneath a carved saint or a painted heraldic shield, acknowledging both protection and jurisdiction. The rhythms of wall building reveal much about medieval priorities. Construction was rarely a single event. Instead, it unfolded across decades, even centuries. A tower might be added when funds permitted, a collapsed section repaired after a flood, a gatehouse expanded when trade increased. The result was rarely symmetrical or planned. Instead, walls grew like living organisms, adapting to pressures of economy, politics, and population. Consider the labor behind them. Masons shaped stone blocks, their hammers ringing rhythmically. Carpenters set scaffolding, binding planks with ropes. Lime burners worked in smoky pits, producing mortar to bind stones together. Each task was repetitive, noisy, and dusty, yet essential. A wall was not the work of a single master architect, but of countless hands, many anonymous, whose sweat soaked into the very fabric of the city. Even before walls reached their mature form, they influenced daily life. Farmers brought produce through gates, paying tolls. Watchmen opened and closed doors at sunrise and sunset. Children grew up tracing their fingers along cold stone, playing in ditches, clambering on rubble. Festivals sometimes centered on gates, with processions passing through to bless fields or welcome rulers. In this way, the walls became not only barriers, but stages upon which civic life unfolded. Different regions developed different styles. In Northern Europe, where stone was abundant, walls rose thick and high, built of limestone or flint. In Italy, brick was often preferred, lending warm hues of red and ochre. In Spain, where Islamic and Christian traditions mingled, fortifications combined horseshoe arches with sturdy battlements. Each variation reflected local materials and cultural influences, yet all shared the same underlying purpose: to enclose, to define, to endure. Yet these early walls were not impregnable. Raiders could burn gates, undermine foundations, or climb with ladders. Floods could erode ditches, frost could crack mortar. The sense of safety was always partial, never absolute. Still, imperfect protection was better than none. The very act of enclosing offered psychological strength. A community that believed itself defended behaved differently than one that felt exposed. In the silence of night, the wall stood as a presence. The watchman's footsteps echoed along the parapet, his breath misting in the cold. Dogs barked faintly in distant yards. Beyond the walls lay shadowed fields, the uncertain rustle of forests, the possibility of strangers. Within, fires glowed in hearths, voices murmured in sleep. The wall was both physical and symbolic, a line of stone that reassured, even as it admitted its limits. By the 12th century, Walls have become almost universal across Europe's growing towns. From England to Italy, from France to the Baltic, city walls defined civic identity. Some places enclosed only a market square and church. Others, like Carcassonne in France or Avila in Spain, built vast, elaborate fortifications that still impress today. The variation in size did not diminish the shared principle. A town without walls was not truly a town at all. The origins of these fortifications, then, are not found in sudden decisions or grand strategies. They are found in gradual acts. A ditch dug here, a palisade raised there, a Roman fragment repurposed, a tower added. They reflect the human need for boundaries, for places to belong, for reassurance against a dangerous and unpredictable world. As you picture these early walls, uneven, patched, sometimes crumbling, sometimes proud, consider the countless lives that passed beneath their gates. Farmers bringing in grain, children running with laughter, merchants cursing tolls, pilgrims muttering prayers. The walls heard them all, silently, steadily, without comment. And as towns grew, so too did their defenses. Walls became higher, thicker, and more elaborate. Towers multiplied, gates grew more complex, ditches deepened. Yet behind each innovation lay the same simple question: how can we keep danger out and safety in? It is here, at this threshold between origins and maturity, that we pause. For if the first walls were humble beginnings, what followed was the long evolution of fortifications into complex systems, fortresses of stone, bristling with towers, crenellations, and clever devices. And so the question arises: how did these walls, born of necessity, transform into the mighty defenses that defined the later medieval city? From simple walls to fortresses. If the earliest medieval walls were humble, patchwork defenses of timber and stone, the centuries that followed brought transformation. By the High Middle Ages, between the 12th and 14th centuries, city walls became not only barriers of survival, but also sophisticated structures of military engineering. They were still built by ordinary masons, carpenters, and laborers, yet their designs reflected both accumulated experience and growing ambition. What had once been mere enclosures now took on the form of fortresses. Walk with me along the parapet of a 13th century town. The wall beneath your feet is thick, so thick, in fact, that 2 carts could pass atop it. At intervals rise towers, some square, some round, each projecting outward so defenders can fire upon enemies who dare approach the curtain wall below. Between towers, crenellations line the battlements, alternating merlons and embrasures, creating a jagged silhouette against the sky. Behind each merlon crouches an archer, bow at the ready, peering through the narrow slit of an embrasure. The wall is no longer a rough boundary, but a carefully designed machine of defense. Its features reveal the lessons of generations. Square towers, once common, had proved vulnerable to sapping. Miners could dig beneath their corners, collapsing them. Round towers, by contrast, deflected projectiles and resisted undermining. Gates, once simple wooden doors, became elaborate gatehouses with portcullises, heavy grills of iron and timber that could be dropped quickly in emergencies. Murder holes in the ceilings above allowed defenders to pour boiling water, heated sand, or stones upon attackers trapped inside the gate passage. Moats, too, grew more sophisticated. In some places, they were filled with water diverted from rivers, forcing besiegers to build bridges under fire. Elsewhere, they remained dry but deep, lined with stakes to discourage approach. The moat was less about drowning an enemy and more about slowing him, keeping him exposed under the arrows of defenders above. The curtain wall itself thickened. Some were built as double walls with a passage between, allowing defenders to move safely and adding depth to the structure. Others incorporated walkways inside, so guards could patrol even in poor weather. Stairs and ramps led to towers, connecting levels. The result was a layered defense, where each element supported the others. Yet these technical details tell only part of the story. Equally important is the social and economic effort behind them. Such fortifications were enormously expensive. Stone had to be quarried, transported, and shaped. Timber was needed for scaffolding, hoists, and gates. Mortar required lime, produced in smoky kilns that consumed vast amounts of firewood. To fund this, towns relied on taxes, tolls, and sometimes direct labor from citizens. In England, a tax called murage was levied specifically for wall maintenance. In France and the Low Countries, guilds sometimes took responsibility for certain sections, repairing and reinforcing them. In Italy, wealthy families might sponsor towers, their coats of arms carved proudly into stone. What seems today a uniform line of masonry was, in reality, a patchwork of contributions, each reflecting the balance of civic pride and financial burden. Consider the life of a mason during such construction. He rises at dawn, shoulders his hammer and chisel, and joins others at the quarry. Blocks of limestone are cut, their surfaces roughened for mortar to grip. Oxen drag sledges toward town, wheels creaking. At the site, scaffolding of timber poles rises against the unfinished wall. Masons climb, balancing on narrow planks, hammering and shaping, their hands white with dust. Mortar is mixed below, water hauled in buckets, lime stinging the skin. The work is repetitive and dangerous, but steady. A single wall project might last decades, ensuring employment across generations. Carpenters, too, played vital roles. They built hoists to lift stones, framed gates, fashioned ladders, and scaffolding. Blacksmiths forged nails, hinges, and the iron tips of portcullises. Laborers hauled rubble to fill cores of walls, their muscles aching under the loads. Women contributed as well, carrying water, mixing mortar, or feeding workers at the site. A wall was not simply stone upon stone. It was the product of an entire community's effort. As fortifications grew, they also changed the shape of towns. Streets often curved to follow walls, houses pressed tightly against them. In some cities, new suburbs sprang up outside the old enclosure, prompting extensions of the walls. Thus, fortification was never static. A 12th century wall might become inadequate by the 14th, requiring expansion. Each new line encompassed fields, houses, and churches that had once stood beyond. Towns grew like ripples, each wall a ring around the older core. Defensive features also bore symbolic weight. A gatehouse was not only a strong point, but a ceremonial entrance. Kings and bishops entered through decorated arches, greeted by crowds. Statues of saints adorned niches above gates, watching over travelers. Coats of arms proclaimed civic pride. What had begun as plain barriers became canvases for meaning. Daily life intertwined with these structures. Watchmen patrolled at night, lanterns swinging, listening for suspicious sounds beyond. Children played in dry moats, chasing geese or rolling hoops. Markets often gathered near gates, where traffic was heaviest. Beggars stationed themselves at entrances, knowing that travelers might spare alms as they entered. For many, the walls were simply part of the backdrop of life, massive, constant, and largely ignored until trouble came. But trouble was never far. The 13th and 14th centuries were times of war and uncertainty. Crusaders marched east, kings fought over territories, and local lords quarreled endlessly. Armies on the move threatened not only castles, but towns. Strong walls could mean the difference between survival and devastation. Chronicles often note that armies bypassed walled cities to plunder weaker ones instead. Thus, the mere sight of a sturdy fortress discouraged attack. At the same time, walls shaped identity. To live inside meant belonging to the civic community. Those outside were foreign, whether peasants in fields or strangers on the road. The gates regulated movement, and with it, notions of trust and suspicion. A merchant passing through submitted to tolls, inspections, even oaths of peace. The wall was not simply a defense, but a filter, deciding who entered and on what terms. As walls became more complex, they also became more expensive to maintain. Stones loosened in frost, timber rotted, mortar crumbled. Watchmen needed wages, gates required repair, towers demanded roofing. Councils debated how to raise funds, issuing new taxes, fining delinquents, or compelling guilds to contribute. Complaints were common. Chronicles mention citizens grumbling at levies, refusing to haul stones, or neglecting assigned duties. Yet neglect could be disastrous. A single breach left unrepaired might endanger the whole community. To walk along the wall, then, was to walk upon centuries of collective effort. Each stone spoke of labor, coin, and compromise. Each tower embodied lessons of past conflicts. Each gate symbolized both openness and control. These were not mute piles of stone, but living structures, woven into the fabric of medieval society. Still, as formidable as they became, walls were not invincible. Siege engines grew in sophistication, trebuchets hurled massive stones, miners tunneled beneath, and by the 14th century, gunpowder cannon began to thunder against masonry. Yet even as their military value shifted, the psychological and civic importance of walls remained. A town with strong fortifications commanded respect. A town without them seemed naked. Pause. Then, at a gatehouse at dusk, the portcullis creaks downward, chains rattling. Merchants hurry inside with their carts. Farmers drive in livestock. Travelers slip through before the doors close. Outside, shadows deepen across the fields. Inside, torches flare, guards call to one another, and the hum of the town quiets as night falls. The wall, massive and silent, has done its work once more. And as you linger in that moment, perhaps one question rises. If walls had become so elaborate, so central to medieval life, what burdens, financial, social, and political, did they impose on those who lived within? How did communities sustain these colossal structures? And what tensions did their upkeep create among guilds, lords, and ordinary citizens? The burden of stone. When one gazes at the remains of medieval city walls today, mighty towers, moss-covered stones, stretches of crumbling battlements, it is easy to think only of their grandeur. Yet for those who lived within them, the walls were not silent monuments, but constant burdens. They had to be built, repaired, and maintained. They consumed coin, labor, and patience. They shaped the economy of towns as much as they shielded them. To understand the real life of a medieval wall, you must look not at the stone itself, but at the endless toil that kept it standing. Murage and the weight of taxes. The most direct burden was financial. In many medieval towns, a special tax called murage was levied specifically for the construction and repair of walls. This tax could take many forms: a fixed toll at the gate, a levy on market goods, or a portion of rents. Sometimes it was collected in coin, other times in labor or materials. For merchants, this meant higher costs of trade. For peasants bringing grain or livestock to market, it meant smaller profits. For townsfolk, it meant one more demand on already thin purses. Records survive from English towns like York, Lincoln, and Exeter, detailing murage grants authorized by kings. These grants allowed towns to collect tolls for years at a time, all earmarked for wall repair. In practice, the money was often insufficient, forcing towns to extend taxes again and again. Complaints arose frequently. Merchants grumbled at paying tolls in every town they entered. Peasants muttered that walls benefited townsfolk more than those who lived outside them. Yet rulers and councils insisted. Without walls, the town was vulnerable, and with vulnerability came ruin. The fairness of murage was often debated. Wealthier citizens sometimes managed to evade or reduce their contributions, while poorer folk paid disproportionately. Guilds were assigned specific portions of wall to maintain. Shoemakers might be responsible for one tower, bakers for another stretch of curtain. In theory, this spread the burden fairly. In practice, it bred resentment. A guild might neglect its duty, leaving stones unrepaired, forcing others to pick up the slack. Town records occasionally note fines imposed on delinquent guilds, but enforcement was uneven. Labor and maintenance. Beyond taxes lay labor. Walls did not maintain themselves. Stones shifted, mortar crumbled, frost cracked surfaces, timber gates rotted. Watchtowers needed roofing, drawbridges required new chains, moats filled with silt. To address these, towns organized periodic wall works, calling upon citizens to contribute manpower. Craftsmen were paid, but ordinary labor often fell upon townsfolk, especially the poorer classes. Imagine a townsperson summoned to haul rubble for repair. He sets aside his trade for the day, shoulders a basket, and joins others trudging to the wall. Under the supervision of masons, they mix mortar, clear ditches, or carry water. The work is heavy, monotonous, and unglamorous, yet refusal risks fines or worse. For those already struggling to earn a living, such duties were resented, even if cloaked in rhetoric of civic pride. Watchmen, too, were a cost. The wall had to be guarded at night and at dawn, gates opened and closed, suspicious strangers questioned. Sometimes towns hired professional guards. Other times, citizens took turns keeping watch. Few enjoyed the task. Standing atop cold stone in the dark, lantern flickering, listening for distant footsteps, was more burden than honor. Yet neglecting such duty invited danger. Chronicles tell of towns surprised because gates were left open or guards were asleep. Economic strains. Walls also distorted trade. Gates were checkpoints where tolls were collected, inspections performed, and weights tested. For merchants, this meant delays and expenses. Some tried to evade tolls by slipping through lesser-known gates or bribing porters. Others grumbled openly, arguing that walls which protected all should not disproportionately burden those who brought goods. In towns with multiple walls, an old inner ring and a newer outer ring, merchants sometimes had to pay at both, doubling their frustration. Markets inside walls thrived because they were secure, but they also grew more expensive. The cost of murage filtered into the price of bread, cloth, and ale. For the poorest townsfolk, this meant higher living costs. While walls were meant to protect them, they sometimes felt more like an invisible tax pressing on every purchase. Social tensions. The burden of walls fostered tension among classes. Wealthy merchants and guild masters might sponsor grand towers, carving their coats of arms into stone, gaining prestige. Meanwhile, poorer folk contributed labor or coin without recognition. Civic pride became stratified. The wall was proclaimed as a symbol of unity, yet within that unity, burdens were unevenly shared. Sometimes, resentment boiled into open conflict. In certain towns, disputes broke out between citizens and councils over wall levies. Chronicles note strikes, refusals to pay, even riots. For those who bore the brunt of taxation, the wall seemed less a shield and more a demand. The irony was sharp. The very structure meant to protect all could also deepen social divides. The burden on innkeepers and travelers. Walls also affected those passing through. Travelers paid tolls at gates, sometimes repeatedly in a single journey. Inns near gates raised prices to cover taxes, passing costs to guests. Pilgrims, often poor, found such tolls a heavy burden, yet had no choice but to pay. The gate thus became both a threshold of safety and a place of extraction. Innkeepers faced obligations as well. Town authorities sometimes required them to host laborers or officials working on the walls. Inns became supply points for food and ale consumed by masons and guards. Profitable in one sense, these duties could also strain resources, especially when payments were delayed. Symbolic burden. Beyond finances and labor, walls carried a symbolic burden. They were constant reminders of vulnerability. Their very presence testified to danger beyond: raiders, bandits, rival lords. To live within walls was to acknowledge a world of threats outside. In times of peace, this reminder could feel unnecessary, even oppressive. Why pay for repairs when no army is near? Why guard gates when roads are quiet? Councils insisted on vigilance, but ordinary folk often saw only needless expense. Yet, when danger returned, the value of walls was suddenly clear. Chronicles record towns saved by strong walls, their citizens grateful they had endured the burden of taxes and labor. Other towns, neglectful of maintenance, fell quickly, their inhabitants lamenting false economy. The paradox was enduring. Walls were resented in peace, cherished in war. Stories of neglect and repair. Accounts from across Europe illustrate this burden vividly. In England, some towns allowed walls to decay in the 13th century, only to scramble for repairs when Scottish raids threatened. In France, guilds were chastised for failing to maintain their assigned towers, leaving breaches unrepaired. In German cities, wealthy merchants sometimes funded lavish repairs, while poorer neighbors muttered at injustice. Everywhere, walls reflected the constant negotiation between necessity and resentment. One chronicler from York described citizens grumbling at murage, calling it the stone tax. Yet when an army approached, those same citizens labored feverishly to patch gaps, hauling stones day and night. The lesson was obvious. The burden of stone was heavy, but the price of weakness heavier still. The emotional weight. For individuals, the wall could be both comfort and cage. A farmer entering at dusk might feel relief as gates closed behind him, shutting out dangers of the open road. Yet he also knew that his coin helped fund those gates, that his labor might be demanded to keep them strong. A merchant resting in his chamber might feel proud of his city's towers, yet curse the tolls that ate into profits. A watchman pacing the parapet might feel duty-bound, yet weary and resentful. This ambivalence is essential to understanding medieval life. The wall was not only a monument of strength, but also a daily reminder of collective obligation. It bound communities together, but also tested their cohesion. It inspired pride, yet bred resentment. It was both shield and burden, protection and demand. The endless cycle. Maintenance never ended. A wall was not built once and left alone. Frost cracked mortar each winter, rain eroded stone, roots pried into foundations. Repairs were constant, like the upkeep of roads or bridges. Just as a millstone had to be dressed repeatedly to grind grain, so a wall had to be patched, reinforced, and renewed. This cycle of work shaped civic identity as much as the stones themselves. Picture, then, a day in late autumn. Citizens trudged to the wall, summoned for repair duty. Masons climb scaffolding, chisels ringing. Women carry water, mixing lime mortar, their hands raw. Children gather fallen rubble into baskets. The work is weary, the air damp, the progress slow. Yet the wall rises, stone upon stone, another layer added to centuries of effort. As dusk falls, the laborers disperse, muttering complaints, yet knowing that tomorrow the wall will stand a little stronger. And as the last light fades, the wall looms over the town, massive and silent, a monument not only to defense but to burden. Its stones whisper of taxes paid, backs bent, tempers frayed, duties endured. To understand a medieval wall is not only to admire its strength, but to feel the weight it pressed upon those who lived in its shadow. So we pause, with one question lingering. If walls consumed so much effort and coin, what happened when armies truly came? When the threat was not distant or imagined, but immediate? How did these burdens of stone transform in the face of siege? And what did it mean for those trapped within when the enemy stood at the gates? Walls and siege and memory. The great paradox of medieval city walls was that most of the time they stood in silence, their battlements empty, their towers untested. They consumed coin and labor year after year, yet many never faced a serious assault. And yet, in those rare and terrifying moments when war arrived at the gates, the entire meaning of the wall was laid bare. To understand their role fully, we must see them in the two lights they cast. First, in the chaos of siege, and second, in the quiet afterlives they lived in memory. The coming of siege. Imagine a town in the 14th century. It is midsummer, and markets bustle, fields ripen, and daily life hums. Then word spreads. An army is advancing. The banners of a rival lord, or perhaps foreign mercenaries, have been sighted. Panic rises. Farmers drive livestock into town. Villagers flee with belongings, and carts crowd the gates. At dusk, the portcullis drops. The heavy doors swing shut, and for the first time in years the wall feels alive with urgency. Defenders take their posts. Archers climb towers. Boiling cauldrons are hauled to battlements. Stones are piled for throwing. Watchmen pace nervously, scanning the horizon. Below, townsfolk pray in churches, children cry, bakers and brewers struggle to provide food for swollen numbers of mouths. The city becomes an island, surrounded not by sea but by fear. Methods of attack. Sieges varied in form, but each tested walls in specific ways. Ladders might be raised, soldiers swarming upward under arrows. Towers on wheels. Massive wooden structures covered in hides soaked with water, rolled forward to match the height of battlements. Miners dug tunnels beneath foundations, propping them with timber, then setting fires to collapse sections of wall. The most formidable weapon was the trebuchet, a vast counterweight engine capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Chronicles describe their terrifying impact, walls shaking under repeated blows, towers cracking, entire houses crushed behind the line of defense. Later came gunpowder cannon, whose thunder shook not only stones but spirits. Walls built for arrows and stones found themselves challenged by iron shot. Inside, the townsfolk endured in fear. They listened to the crash of missiles, the groan of collapsing masonry, the shouts of soldiers. Dust filled the air, food supplies dwindled, wells grew foul. The burden of walls became heavier. They enclosed safety, yes, but also trapped hunger, disease, and despair. Daily life under siege. For ordinary people, life in a besieged town was monotonous misery. Bread grew scarce, meat disappeared, ale soured. Water from wells was rationed. Families crowded into cellars, sleeping among sacks of grain or barrels of fish. Rats, once kept at bay, multiplied in the shadows. Churches overflowed with frightened worshippers, their prayers mixing with the rumble of war outside. Children played no longer in the streets. They huddled against mothers, listening to the distant hammering of siege works. Merchants hid coins, guilds guarded their supplies, and arguments broke out over rations. The wall, once resented for its taxes, was now the only shield between life and death. The moment of breach. Sometimes, despite all, the wall held. Siege armies, unable to break through, withdrew after weeks or months, their supplies exhausted. Towns celebrated with relief, praising the strength of their defenses. Chronicles recorded miracles, attributing survival to saints as much as to stones. But sometimes the wall failed. A tower collapsed under bombardment, a gate was betrayed, or hunger forced surrender. When enemies poured through breaches, slaughter often followed. Fire consumed houses, citizens were killed or enslaved, goods plundered. The wall that had defined safety became a broken husk, its failure a collective trauma. One can imagine the silence after such a fall. Smoke curling above ruins, stones blackened, corpses unburied. Survivors remembered not only the horror but the sense of betrayal. This structure, maintained with so much effort, had crumbled when most needed. And yet, in time, they rebuilt, thicker and higher than before. The burden began anew. Symbolism of survival. Walls that survived sieges became legends. Carcassonne in France, with its double ring of towers, was said to be impregnable. Avila in Spain, crowned with 90 towers, seemed eternal. Lübeck in Germany boasted gates adorned with statues, proclaiming both strength and wealth. These fortifications were not merely practical. They became symbols of civic pride, proof that the community within was worthy of endurance. In many towns, festivals celebrated walls. Processions circled their perimeter, priests blessed gates, citizens paraded with banners. Children grew up not just within walls, but with stories of their defense, learning to see them as both physical and spiritual guardians. The slow decline. By the 15th century, however, change was inevitable. Gunpowder artillery grew stronger, walls crumbled more easily, and new designs, low, thick, angled bastions, replaced old high towers. The star-shaped fortresses of the Renaissance eclipsed medieval designs. Town walls, once essential, became obsolete. Some were dismantled for stone, others allowed to crumble. Houses crept against them, gardens filled moats, and gates were opened permanently to traffic. And yet, the memory remained. Travelers still entered towns through arches blackened with smoke, past towers scarred by war, and walked streets that curved where battlements once stood. The presence of walls continued to define identity, even when their military role had faded. Walls as memory. In the centuries that followed, walls became romantic ruins. Poets wrote of ivy-clad towers, artists sketched crumbling arches, antiquarians measured ancient stones. For townsfolk, they were both nuisance and heritage. Some complained that walls blocked growth, others cherished them as links to the past. Today, when you stroll along the preserved walls of York, or gaze at the vast fortifications of Carcassonne, you see both the practical work of masons and the lingering aura of centuries. The stones are silent, but they whisper of watchmen pacing at night, of guilds arguing over taxes, of children huddling during sieges, of merchants cursing tolls. The wall is witness. Perhaps the most important truth is that walls were witnesses. They saw more than kings or chronicles ever recorded. They watched the slow tread of peasants bringing grain to market, the weary shuffle of pilgrims, the swagger of soldiers, the tears of widows. They heard the hum of prayer, the ring of hammer on chisel, the crack of siege stones. Their silence is deceptive, for in that silence lies memory. To stand by a medieval wall today is to touch a structure built not once, but endlessly, layer upon layer, by hands now forgotten. It is to feel the burden of stone and the endurance of community. Closing reflection. And so, the story of medieval walls ends not with their destruction, but with their transformation into memory. They began as humble palisades, grew into mighty fortresses, consumed labor and coin, bore the weight of sieges, and finally crumbled into heritage. Their paradox remains. They protected, but they burdened. They united, but they divided. They endured, but they decayed. Close your eyes and picture the wall at twilight. The portcullis lowered, the torches flickering, the parapet lined with silent figures. Beyond lies the dark, uncertain world. Within, the muted hum of life. The wall is both barrier and boundary, a presence as constant as breath. And as you drift toward sleep, one last question lingers. If walls shaped medieval life so deeply, what silent structures shape ours today? What boundaries, visible or invisible, define our sense of safety, belonging, and memory?